Before we dive into this incredible tale of loyalty and sacrifice from the frozen lands of the North, show your support by hitting that like button. Subscribe to our channel for more epic Norse mythology stories, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your engagement helps us bring you more amazing Viking legends. Now let's begin this unforgettable journey. The bitter wind howled across the fjords of Norseland, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. 15-year-old Eirik Erensson trudged through the deep snow, his leather boots crunching with each determined step. The hunting party had returned to the village of Ravenshollow 3 days ago, but Eirik had ventured out alone, drawn by strange sounds echoing from the forbidden valley beyond the sacred grove. His father, Thorvald the Stormbreaker, had forbidden anyone from entering these ancient woods, claiming they were cursed by the old gods. But Eirik had always been different from the other young warriors in training. Where they saw omens and superstition, he saw curiosity and wonder. His mother, Astrid, often said he had inherited her gentle heart rather than his father's iron will. As he pushed through a thicket of frost-laden branches, Eirik heard it again, a low rumbling sound that seemed to shake the very earth beneath his feet. It wasn't the growl of a bear or the call of any creature he knew from these northern lands. This sound carried pain, desperation, and something else, intelligence. The clearing opened before him like a natural amphitheater, surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to reach toward Odin's hall itself. And there, collapsed in the center of the clearing, lay the most magnificent and terrifying creature Eirik had ever beheld. The dragon was massive, easily the length of 3 longships placed end to end. Its scales shimmered like polished emeralds in the pale afternoon light, each one the size of a warrior's shield. Great wings, torn and bleeding, spread across the snow-covered ground like fallen sails. The beast's breathing was labored, sending great puffs of steam into the frigid air. Eirik should have run. Every instinct, every lesson from his father, every story told around the hearth fires screamed at him to flee. Dragons were the enemies of men, the destroyers of villages, the harbingers of death and destruction. But as he looked into the creature's eyes, ancient, wise, and filled with unmistakable pain, he saw something that changed everything. The dragon was dying. A massive spear, clearly of human make, protruded from between the creature's ribs. The weapon bore the markings of the Bloodaxe clan, their sworn enemies from across the western mountains. Dark blood, almost black in the snow, pooled beneath the wounded beast. For a long moment, boy and dragon regarded each other in silence. The creature's breathing grew more shallow with each passing second, and Eirik found himself stepping forward despite every rational thought in his head. "Easy, great one," he whispered in the old tongue his grandmother had taught him. "I mean you no harm." The dragon's massive head lifted slightly, and those ancient eyes fixed upon him with an intensity that seemed to peer into his very soul. There was recognition there, and perhaps gratitude? Eirik approached slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. The spear would have to come out, but removing it might kill the dragon instantly. Still, leaving it would certainly mean death. The young Viking had helped his mother tend to wounded warriors many times, and he knew that sometimes the greatest act of mercy was also the greatest risk. "This is going to hurt," he said softly, gripping the spear's shaft with both hands. The dragon watched him, making no move to defend itself. It was as if the creature understood that this strange young human was its only hope. With all his strength, Eirik pulled. The spear came free with a wet, tearing sound that made his stomach lurch. The dragon's roar of pain shook snow from the surrounding trees and sent birds fleeing in all directions. But the beast did not strike at him, did not unleash the legendary dragon fire that could melt steel and stone. Instead, it looked at him with what could only be described as wonder. Working quickly, Eirik removed his heavy winter cloak and pressed it against the gaping wound. The dragon's blood soaked through the thick wool instantly, but the pressure seemed to slow the flow. He had brought his hunting pack, which contained dried meat, healing herbs his mother had taught him to recognize, and a water skin. "I don't know if these will help you," he said, pulling out a bundle of yarrow and comfrey leaves. "But my mother says they heal wounds and stop bleeding." The dragon lowered its great head to the ground, exhaustion overtaking it. Eric worked for hours as the winter sun tracked across the sky, cleaning the wound as best he could and packing it with the healing herbs. He gave the creature what water he could, though it seemed like trying to fill a fjord with a cup. As darkness began to fall, Eric knew he had to return to the village or face his father's wrath. But he couldn't abandon the dragon, not when it might die alone in the cold. "I'll come back," he promised, looking into those ancient eyes. "I'll bring more supplies, more medicine, just please don't die." The dragon made a sound deep in its throat, not a roar or growl, but something almost like a purr. One massive claw reached out and gently touched the boy's shoulder, careful not to pierce his skin with its razor-sharp point. Eric ran through the forest as he never had before, his heart pounding with more than just exertion. He had done something that would be considered treason by his people, madness by his father, and heresy by the village elders. But he had also done something that felt more right than anything he had ever done in his young life. Over the following weeks, Eric became a master of deception. He told his parents he was practicing his hunting skills in the deep woods, honing his survival abilities for the coming warrior trials. His father approved of this dedication, never suspecting that his son was actually tending to their people's greatest enemy. Each day, Eirik brought food, fish from the streams, rabbits from his snares, even precious dried meat from their winter stores. The dragon ate everything gratefully, growing stronger with each passing day. He brought healing salves his mother made, claiming he needed them for training injuries. He brought warm furs to help the creature conserve heat during the brutal northern nights, but most importantly, he brought companionship. The dragon, Eirik discovered, was incredibly intelligent. It learned to understand his words, responding with different tones and gestures. When Eric spoke of his fears about the upcoming warrior trials, the dragon would make soft, comforting sounds. When he shared stories of village life, the creature listened with obvious interest. Eric began to call the dragon Grimjaw, though he suspected the creature had its own name in whatever ancient language dragons spoke. Grimjaw seemed to approve of the name, or at least tolerate it with good humor. "My father wants me to be like him," Eric confided one afternoon as he helped clean dirt from between the dragon's scales. "Strong, fierce, unforgiving. He says a true Viking shows no mercy to his enemies, takes what he wants by force, and rules through fear." Grimjaw rumbled deep in his throat, a sound Eric had learned meant disagreement or displeasure. "You don't think so either, do you?" Eric smiled. "My mother says there's strength in kindness, wisdom in mercy. She says the greatest warriors are those who know when not to fight." The dragon's recovery was remarkable. Within a month, the wound had closed completely, leaving only a pale scar between the emerald scales. Grimjaw could move freely again, though he remained in the hidden clearing, seemingly content to stay near his unlikely friend. It was during the second month of their secret friendship that everything changed. Eric had arrived for his daily visit to find Grimjaw standing at the edge of the clearing, his great head raised toward the sky. The dragon's posture was alert, almost tense, as if listening to something beyond human hearing. "What is it?" Eric asked, following the dragon's gaze upward. Grimjaw looked down at him, and in those ancient eyes, Eric saw something he had never seen before: sadness. The dragon lowered his massive head until it was level with the boy's face, and breathed gently upon him. The warm breath carried scents of far-off lands, exotic flowers, distant seas, mountains beyond imagination. "You have to go, don't you?" Eric whispered, understanding flooding through him. The dragon nodded slowly, unmistakably. Then, with movements as gentle as a mother with her child, Grimjaw reached out and touched one gleaming claw to Eirik's forehead. For a moment, images flashed through the boy's mind. Soaring above clouds, ancient cities of gold and crystal, other dragons dancing in the aurora borealis. It was as if Grimjaw was sharing memories, showing him glimpses of a world beyond the frozen fjords of Norseland. When the vision faded, tears were streaming down Eric's face. "Will I ever see you again?" he asked. Grimjaw's response was to gently nuzzle the boy's cheek, and then speak in a voice like distant thunder. "I will never forget your kindness, young one. Should you ever have need of me, call my name to the winds, and I will hear you." It was the first and last time Eric heard the dragon speak in human words, and the voice would echo in his memory for the rest of his life. With one final look at the boy who had saved his life, Grimjaw spread his great wings, now fully healed and magnificent in their power. The dragon launched himself into the sky with a grace that defied his massive size, climbing higher and higher until he was just a speck against the clouds, and then he was gone. Eric stood alone in the clearing for a long time, feeling as though part of his soul had flown away with his friend. He was no longer the same boy who had stumbled upon a wounded dragon months ago. Something fundamental had changed within him, though he wouldn't fully understand what until years had passed. When he finally returned to Ravenshollow that evening, his father noticed his red eyes and somber mood. "You look as though someone has died," Thorvald said gruffly. "What troubles you, my son?" "Nothing, father," Eric replied. "I was just thinking about what it means to be a warrior." Thorvald clapped him on the shoulder, mistaking his son's melancholy for nervousness about the upcoming trials. "You will make a fine warrior, Eric. You have been dedicated in your training, spending so much time in the wilderness. Soon you will join the raiding parties and prove your worth in battle." But Eric knew now that his path would be different from what his father envisioned. He had learned that true strength sometimes meant showing mercy to one's enemies, that the greatest victories were not always won through violence, and that the bonds formed between unlikely friends could be stronger than those forged in blood. The clearing remained empty for the rest of that winter, but Eric continued to visit it regularly, always hoping to see a familiar shadow pass overhead. Spring came and went, then summer, then another harsh winter. The boy became a man, passing his warrior trials with skill and honor, though he was noted for his unusual reluctance to deliver killing blows in combat and his tendency to show mercy to defeated foes. His reputation as a skilled but uncommonly compassionate warrior spread throughout the region. Some called him weak, others recognized the strength it took to stay one's hand when blood was hot and victory within reach. Eirik cared little for either opinion. He had learned his values from the wisest teacher he had ever known, and he would not abandon them for the approval of men who had never looked into a dragon's eyes and seen intelligence, pain, and gratitude looking back. 5 years had passed since Grimjaw's departure, and Ravenshollow had grown into one of the most prosperous settlements in the northern fjords. Under Thorvald, the Stormbreakers' leadership, their warriors had successfully repelled 3 separate raids from the Bloodaxe clan, and their fishing fleets brought in larger catches each season. The village now boasted nearly 300 souls, with new longhouses being built each spring to accommodate families drawn by their reputation for strength and prosperity. Eirik, now 20 years old, had earned his place among the village's most respected warriors, though his methods remained unconventional. Where others might burn an enemy's crops, he would negotiate compensation. Where others would take captives for slaves, he would arrange exchanges of goods or services. His approach had earned Ravenshollow unexpected allies among neighboring settlements, and even some former enemies had become trading partners. But not everyone approved of these changes. "Your son fights like a woman," Gunnar Bloodfist complained to Thorvald during a village council meeting. "He shows mercy to those who would show us none. He negotiates when he should conquer. This weakness will be our downfall." Thorvald's jaw tightened, but he had learned to trust his son's instincts. The prosperity Eirik's diplomatic approach had brought to their village was undeniable, even if it went against traditional Viking values. "My son's methods have brought us wealth and security," Thorvald replied firmly. Our granaries are full, our trade routes are secure, and we have fewer enemies today than we did 5 years ago. Perhaps there is strength in his weakness that you fail to see." The debate might have continued, but it was interrupted by the sound of horns from the watchtowers, not the single blast that signaled returning fishing boats, but the rapid, urgent pattern that meant only one thing: enemy ships on the horizon. Eric was among the first to reach the watchtowers, his long legs carrying him swiftly up the wooden ladders. What he saw from the platform made his blood run cold. The sea was black with ships, not the handful of vessels they had faced in previous raids, but an entire fleet, 60, perhaps 70 longships flying the crimson banners of the Bloodaxe clan, approaching from the west in perfect formation. This was not a raid, it was an invasion. "How many warriors?" Thorvald demanded as he joined his son on the platform. "At least 2,000, Eirik replied grimly. "Maybe more. They're not just from the Bloodaxe clan. I can see banners from the Iron Wolves, the Sea Serpents, and others I don't recognize. The entire Western Alliance," Thorvald breathed. "Magnus Bloodaxe has united them all." Below in the village, the alarm horns continued to sound as families rushed to gather their belongings and retreat to the central hall, the largest and most defensible building in Ravenshollow. But Eirik knew it would not be enough. Their own forces numbered barely 300 warriors, and many of those were young men who had never faced serious battle. "We need to send messengers to our allies," Eric said urgently. "The settlements at Ironfjord and Whale Bay. If they march immediately, they might reach us before—" "There isn't time," his father interrupted. "Look at the wind patterns. Those ships will make landfall within 3 hours. Our allies are 2 days away at best." The reality of their situation settled over both men like a shroud. Ravenshollow, for all its prosperity and growth, was about to face annihilation. The Western Alliance had brought enough warriors to crush not just their settlement, but every village within 100 miles of the coast. "We evacuate," Thorvald decided. "Send the women, children, and elderly into the deep forest. The warriors will delay the enemy as long as possible, then retreat to the mountains." "No," Eric said quietly, his gaze still fixed on the approaching fleet. "If we abandon the village, they'll hunt down the refugees and slaughter them in the woods. And if we retreat to the mountains, we'll survive the winter only to face the same problem in the spring. They'll keep coming until we're all dead." "Then what do you propose?" his father asked. "Stand and fight, die gloriously in a battle we cannot win?" Eric was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities, strategies, anything that might save his people. And then, unbidden, a memory surfaced. Ancient eyes filled with gratitude, a voice like distant thunder. "Should you ever have need of me, call my name to the winds, and I will hear you." "Father," Eric said slowly, "do you trust me?" Thorvald studied his son's face, seeing something there he had never seen before. A certainty, a quiet confidence that seemed to come from some deep, unshakable source. "With my life," he replied without hesitation. "Then give me 1 hour. Keep the warriors ready, but don't engage the enemy until I return. No matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear, wait for my signal." Before Thorvald could respond, Eric was already climbing down from the watchtower, moving with urgent purpose through the panicking village. He ran toward the forest, toward the sacred grove and the forbidden valley beyond, following a path he had not walked in years, but which remained burned into his memory. The clearing looked exactly as it had on that final day 5 years ago. Snow covered the ground despite the late spring date. This high in the mountains, winter never truly ended. Eric stood in the center of the space, where he had first seen Grimjaw collapsed and bleeding, and raised his voice to the sky. "Grimjaw!" he called, his voice echoing off the surrounding peaks. "Great One, if you can hear me, I need your help. My people are in danger. Please, I call upon the bond between us." The wind answered him with silence. Eirik called again, louder this time, pouring all his desperation and hope into the ancient name. Birds fled from the trees at the sound, but no shadow passed overhead, no familiar rumble disturbed the mountain quiet. Minutes passed, then an hour. In the distance, Eric could hear the sounds of battle beginning, the clash of weapons, the shouts of warriors, the crash of spear against shield. The enemy had reached Ravenshollow, and his father had been forced to engage them without waiting for his return. "Please," Eric whispered, falling to his knees in the snow. "I saved your life once. I'm begging you to save theirs." And then, like thunder rolling across the mountains, he heard it, a roar that shook the very stones beneath his feet. The sky darkened as a massive shadow passed overhead, and Eric looked up to see the most beautiful sight he had ever beheld. Grimjaw descended from the clouds like a falling star, his scales now shining with an inner light that made them appear almost crystalline. He was larger than before, more magnificent, as if the years had allowed him to grow into the fullness of his power. Great wings that could blot out the sun spread wide as he settled into the clearing with earth-shaking grace. The dragon's ancient eyes found Eric immediately, and in them the young man saw not just recognition, but joy. Grimjaw lowered his massive head until it was level with Eric's face, just as he had done years ago, and breathed gently upon him in greeting. "You came," Eric whispered, reaching out to touch the familiar snout. "You actually came." Grimjaw's response was to lift his head toward the village, where smoke was now rising and the sounds of battle grew more intense. The dragon's expression hardened, ancient fury kindling in those wise eyes. "They're slaughtering my people," Eric explained unnecessarily. "Thousands of warriors from the western clans. We can't stop them alone." The dragon's roar of anger made the previous sound seem like a whisper. Ice cracked from the surrounding trees, and somewhere in the distance, an avalanche began its thunderous descent down a mountainside. When Grimjaw spread his wings, Eric could see the muscles bunching in the creature's powerful shoulders. "Take me with you," Eric said, surprising himself with the words. "Let me fight beside you." For a moment, dragon and man regarded each other in silence. Then Grimjaw lowered himself to the ground, extending one wing in an unmistakable invitation. Eric climbed onto the dragon's back, finding handholds among the great ridge of scales that ran down Grimjaw's spine. The ascent was unlike anything he could have imagined. The ground fell away beneath them with breathtaking speed, and suddenly Eric could see the entire fjord spread out below. The enemy fleet blackened the water like a plague, while the beaches were crowded with warriors advancing on his village. Ravenshallow's defenders had formed a defensive line just outside the settlement, but they were vastly outnumbered and being pushed steadily back. "Now," Eric said grimly, "show them the fury of dragons." Grimjaw's response was to fold his wings and dive. The enemy warriors had no warning. One moment they were pressing their attack against the retreating villagers, drunk on their numerical superiority and the promise of easy victory. The next moment, death descended from the sky on emerald wings. Dragonfire was not the crude flame of mortal torches or hearthfires. It burned with the heat of the earth's molten core, turning sand to glass and iron to vapor. Grimjaw's first pass incinerated an entire rank of Bloodaxe warriors, their screams cut short as they were reduced to ash in seconds. The dragon's claws were equally devastating. Each one was the size of a warrior's sword and harder than the finest steel. A sweep of Grimjaw's talons could cut through a dozen enemy soldiers as easily as a scythe through wheat. But it was the dragon's roar that truly broke the enemy's spirit. The sound was primordial terror made manifest, reaching into the deepest, most animal part of the human brain and activating fears that had kept their ancestors alive in a world full of predators. Warriors who had faced bears and wolves without flinching threw down their weapons and fled at the sound. On Grimjaw's back, Eric felt a savage joy he had never experienced before. This was not the controlled violence of warrior combat or the calculated strategy of defense. This was raw, elemental power unleashed in service of justice. For the first time in his life, he understood why dragons were feared throughout the 9 realms. The enemy fleet tried to retreat, but Grimjaw was faster than their swiftest longships. One by one, the dragon incinerated the vessels, leaving no escape for the invading force. The waters of the fjord boiled with dragonfire, and the screams of dying warriors echoed off the surrounding mountains. In less than an hour, the entire Western Alliance was destroyed. Of the nearly 3,000 warriors who had come to conquer Raven's Hollow, perhaps a few dozen survived to flee into the wilderness. The rest were ash on the wind or food for the fish. As Grimjaw circled back toward the village, Eric could see his people emerging from their defensive positions, staring up at the sky in wonder and terror. He knew that many of them would never look at him the same way again. He had become something other than human in their eyes, a dragon rider, a wielder of powers beyond mortal comprehension. But as they landed in the village square, it was not fear he saw in their faces, but gratitude. These were his people, his family, his friends. They had been saved from certain death, and they cared little about the means of their salvation. Thorvald was the first to approach, his weathered face showing a mixture of pride, confusion, and concern. "My son," he said carefully, "I think you have some explaining to do." Before Eric could respond, a new sound filled the air. Not the roar of dragons or the clash of battle, but something far more ominous. It was the whistle of arrows, dozens of them, arcing down from the surrounding hills. The survivors of the enemy fleet had not all fled. Some had circled around through the forest, armed with powerful longbows and arrows tipped with cold iron, the one metal that could pierce dragon scales. They had waited for Grimjaw to land, to become a stationary target, before launching their coordinated assault. The arrows struck the dragon from all sides, most bouncing harmlessly off his armored hide, but several finding gaps between scales or striking vulnerable points along his wings and neck. Grimjaw roared in pain and fury, spinning to face his attackers, but more arrows were already in the air. "No!" Eric screamed, sliding down from the dragon's back to try to shield his friend's wounded areas with his own body. That was when Magnus Bloodaxe himself stepped out from behind a burning house, carrying a spear unlike any Eric had ever seen. The weapon was massive, its head forged from star metal and inscribed with runes of binding and domination. It pulsed with an inner darkness that seemed to drink in the light around it. "Did you think your pet monster would save you forever, boy?" Magnus snarled. "This is Dragon's Bane, forged by the Dark Elves themselves. No dragon can withstand its bite." He hurled the spear with inhuman strength, and despite Grimjaw's attempt to dodge, the weapon struck true. The star metal head punched through the dragon's chest armor like it was made of parchment, sinking deep into the creature's heart. Grimjaw's roar of agony shattered windows throughout the village. The dragon collapsed to his knees, then onto his side, his magnificent wings spreading across the cobblestones like fallen banners. Dark blood, almost black in color, poured from the wound. "Grimjaw!" Eric cried, rushing to his friend's side. The dragon's eyes were already growing dim, but they focused on him with obvious effort. "I told you, I would never forget," Grimjaw whispered in that voice like distant thunder. "Your kindness saved me once. Now I return the favor." The dragon's great claw reached out and touched Eric's chest, directly over his heart. What happened next defied all understanding, all natural law. The dragon's blood, flowing from the mortal wound, began to glow with inner fire. Droplets of it touched Eric's skin and seemed to be absorbed, sinking into his very flesh. Power beyond imagining flooded through Eric's body. His muscles felt like they were being remade, his bones becoming harder than steel, his senses expanding beyond human limitations. He could feel Grimjaw's consciousness touching his own, the dragon's ancient wisdom and strength flowing into him like water into a dry riverbed. "What have you done?" Eric gasped. "Given you what you need. To protect them," Grimjaw replied, his voice growing fainter with each word. "Dragon's blood carries our essence. You are no longer merely human." Magnus Bloodaxe stepped closer, drawing his sword with the obvious intention of finishing both dragon and rider. But when he looked into Eric's eyes, he saw something that made him step back in instinctive fear. The young Viking's eyes were no longer human. They glowed with inner fire, ancient and wise and utterly merciless. When Eric stood, his movements had the fluid grace of a predator, and the air around him shimmered with barely contained power. "You killed my friend," Eric said quietly, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in the listener's bones. Magnus raised his sword, but before he could strike, Eric moved. The transformation had given him speed beyond human capability. One moment, he was standing beside the dying dragon. The next, his hand was wrapped around Magnus's throat, lifting the larger man off the ground as easily as a child lifting a doll. Dragonfire burned in Eric's eyes, and Magnus Bloodaxe, terror of the western seas, conqueror of a dozen settlements, slayer of countless warriors, screamed in primal fear. "Please," Magnus gasped, "I yield. I surrender." For a moment, Eric hesitated. The old part of him, the part that had always chosen mercy over vengeance, warred with the dragon's fury that now burned in his veins. Grimjaw had given him power, but had he also given him the dragon's nature? Would he become a creature of wrath and destruction, ruling through fear as dragons had always done? Then he looked back at Grimjaw, whose ancient eyes were fixed on him with the last of the dragon's fading strength. And in those eyes he saw not encouragement for violence, but a reminder of the lesson he had learned years ago in a snow-covered clearing. That true strength sometimes meant showing mercy to one's enemies. Eric released his grip, letting Magnus fall to the ground, gasping and choking. "Leave," he said simply. "Take what remains of your forces and go. If you ever threaten my people again, I will not be so merciful." Magnus scrambled to his feet and fled without another word, his surviving warriors close behind him. They would spread word throughout the northern lands of what they had seen. A dragon rider who commanded power beyond mortal understanding, but who still possessed a human heart. By the time Eric turned back to Grimjaw, the dragon was gone. The great body lay still, the magnificent eyes closed forever. But somehow, Eric could still feel his friend's presence, not gone, but transformed, living on in the power that now flowed through his veins. The villagers approached cautiously, unsure how to react to their transformed defender. It was Thorvald who broke the silence. "My son," he said quietly, "what are you now?" Eric looked down at his hands, seeing the faint glow that pulsed beneath his skin, in rhythm with his heartbeat. He could feel the dragon's strength within him, the ability to soar through the skies, to breathe fire that could melt mountains, to inspire terror in his enemies with a single glance. But he could also feel something else, the memory of a wounded creature accepting help from an enemy, the wisdom that came from understanding both sides of the eternal conflict between men and dragons, the knowledge that true power lay not in dominance, but in protection. "I am what I have always been," he replied finally, "a son of Raven's Hollow, a protector of my people, and a friend to those who show kindness to others, regardless of what form they take." He knelt beside Grimjaw's still form, placing his hand on the dragon's great head one last time. "Thank you, old friend," he whispered. "I will never forget." 20 years passed, and the legend of Eric Dragonheart spread throughout the northern kingdoms. Under his protection, Raven's Hollow grew into the greatest settlement in the known world, a place where former enemies could find peace, where the weak were protected, and where ancient wisdom was valued above brute strength. Eric never aged as other men did, the dragon's blood preserving him in the prime of life. He could soar through the clouds on wings of fire when needed, his transformed nature allowing him to take draconic form in times of great crisis. But he spent most of his time in human shape, walking among his people as their leader and protector. He never took a wife, claiming that his heart belonged to the memory of a friend who had taught him the true meaning of loyalty. But he raised dozens of orphan children as his own, teaching them the lessons Grimjaw had taught him, that strength without compassion was merely brutality, that the greatest victories were those won without bloodshed. and that sometimes the most unlikely friendships could change the world. In the sacred grove beyond the village, where a wounded dragon had once lain dying in the snow, Eric built a monument of polished stone. Upon it were carved the words that Grimjaw had spoken in his final moments: "I will never forget." And indeed neither would he, for as long as he lived, which with dragon's blood in his veins might be a very long time indeed, Eric would remember the lesson learned in that clearing so many years ago, that kindness shown to those who have no claim upon it is never truly forgotten, and that the greatest magic in all the 9 realms is the bond between unlikely friends. The monument still stands today, though Raven's Hollow itself has long since grown into a mighty city. Travelers from distant lands come to see the stone dragon carved into its surface, and to hear the tale of the Viking who saved a dragon, and the dragon who saved them all in return. Some say that on clear nights, when the aurora dances across the northern sky, you can still see 2 figures in the lights, a man and a dragon, flying together through eternity, bound by friendship that transcends death itself. What an incredible journey through the frozen fjords of Norse legend. The bond between Eric and Grimjaw shows us that true friendship knows no boundaries, not even between ancient enemies. If this epic tale of loyalty, sacrifice, and the power of kindness moved you, smash that like button, subscribe for more amazing Norse mythology stories, and let us know in the comments what legendary creature you'd like to see featured next. Your support helps us bring these timeless tales to life. Until next time, may your heart be as brave as a Viking and as loyal as a dragon.